In this video, I'm going to show you around a flying command and control center that could unleash nuclear Armageddon. I'll show you the cockpit, the very sobering launch keyhole, and I'll explain what this is, and no, it's not for in-air refueling. I'm Stewart, and I make videos about planes and a few rockets. This includes reviews of flights from around the world and detailed tours through interesting aircraft in museums just like this one. If you're into these types of videos, then please check out my channel and subscribe. And a massive thanks to the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum near Omaha for letting me film inside this aircraft. They've got a great range of aircraft on display and well worth a visit. Let's begin with some history. Operation Looking Glass was the codename for the airborne command and control center operated by the USA, with the idea being that this would assume control if a nuclear attack took out the ground-based control centers. The Looking Glass flights were operated by several EC-135s and first began on February 3, 1961 and ceased continuous airborne alert on July 24, 1990, but they remained active either on the ground or airborne until October 1, 1998. Then the US Navy E-6Bs took over that role. While the new jets look similar, they are based on the larger 707-300 powered by more efficient high bypass CFM turbofans. The senior officer on board acts as the Airborne Emergency Action Officer, who has the authority to command execution of nuclear attacks. This person was supported by a battle staff of around 20 people, and another 10-ish were responsible for operating the aircraft. The plane itself looks like a 707, but isn't, and let me explain. You have the original 367-80 prototype that was developed into the 707 and the shorter and thinner Model 717. Now I should clarify that the name changes as the eventual Boeing 717 was a completely unrelated rear-engine twinjet. This Model 717 formed the base for the tanker KC-135 and the transport C-135, and this EC-135 is based on the latter. Starting at the nose, and what stands out is the black paint, which isn't common these days. The upper part is a matte black color, and that's designed to reduce the reflected light that would otherwise be angled directly into the crew's face. Further forward, you'll notice that it's a shiny black, and that's because the cover over the radar inside could not be metal, as that would interfere with the radar itself, so they use a lighter material which could be easily damaged, so then that was covered with a black rubber coating. Paint has since improved, hence why newer aircraft don't have the rubber covering. Another interesting thing about the whole forward section of the aircraft is that it's essentially identical to the 707 and even the modern 737 MAX. Boeing figured that they were onto a good thing and didn't see any reason to change it. Up here on the port side is the pitot tube and the aircraft serial number. Down here is the crew entry door surrounded by a yellow line to help get the attention of rescue crews in the case of an emergency, and we'll crawl up there soon. Looking under here is a lot of equipment that you won't see on a regular 707. These black objects on the side are the lights used to communicate with the aircraft below coming up to refuel. The yellow strip is the center line to help them line up as well. Here they are on another aircraft from a greater distance to give you some perspective. The white object here is a radar Doppler to provide the distance to the ground for the crew, and there's multiple communication antennas ready to take some skin off a ground crew's forehead, hence the caution tape. Up here are cooling air vents, as just behind them is a whole array of electronic equipment, which would generate a lot of heat. Now I'm sure you've felt a laptop heat up when it's working hard. Well, imagine a computer 1,000 times larger, but a lot slower, working away and generating a huge amount of heat. This was certainly before the era of solid-state hardware with its minimal moving parts. This here is, well, obviously, a cargo door. Because of the size of much of the equipment inside, they'd need a much larger door to move it all in and out. There was also a door installed in it where the dignitaries would enter, as the generals wouldn't want to crawl up the ladder with everyone else. By the way, a looking glass is another name for a mirror, and that was chosen because this mirrors the Strategic Air Command's underground command post at Offutt Air Force Base. Moving further aft, and we'll see the orange, black and white very low and low frequency trailing wire antenna. This was up to a mile long, and the idea was that the plane would fly around in a tight circle, dropping this down below, making for a massive antenna to allow it to communicate with submarines from all around the world. Moving around, and we'll look at the main landing gear, which consists of two four-wheel bogies. Of interest, they're not especially long in contrast with large prop airliners from that era. Obviously, they needed a lot of ground clearance because of the large props, so the change to the turbojets and then low bypass turbofans meant that the whole aircraft could be closer to the ground, allowing for easier access for crew and cargo. Another thing you may not have noticed is that there's no lower cargo door on this. In fact, unlike the larger 707, all of the C-135 brothers, including the KC-135, had no lower level storage and instead had extra fuel tanks down there. The main deck on these was used for other purposes, such as cargo, or in this case, all of the launch and communication equipment. Here's a 707 with the cargo doors visible for comparison's sake. This white object up here is the antenna for what was part of the low-frequency receiver system, and that works in conjunction with other antennas, including the black saddle on top of the fuselage. And down here, and there's an interesting warning saying to keep at least 10 feet from the antenna when it was transmitting. This is because there was an amplifier in there that increased the intensity of outgoing signals, as this was a part of the worldwide airborne command post network, potentially requiring communication between other aircraft anywhere in the world. This was also an in-air refueler, and back here is the contraption for that. In here is a window for the boom operator to look down at the attacking thirsty aircraft. Of interest, I believe the new KC-46 tankers don't have a physical window, and the boom operators use screens, which apparently has made the depth perception very challenging. And then turning around, and you have the physical boom itself, which is stabilized by fins towards the sides. These would tag team with the next EC-135 and not land until the other one was in the air, so they would actually transfer excess fuel to the next aircraft in flight before landing themselves. Now those keen spotters among you will have noticed that this is missing the wings, and that's partially because the museum doesn't have enough space. But if you do have a spare 20 million cash, I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. This aircraft, being an EC-135C model, was fitted with Pratt & Whitney JT3D low bypass turbofans shared with the 707, B-52H, KC-135E Stratotanker, C-141 and the DC-8. This design first flew in 1959 and was a development from the JT3C turbojets. Its military name, so that would apply to this aircraft, was the TF-33, producing 18,000 pounds of thrust each. As well as being the first jet transporter, this was also the first transporter in the USAF to have a swept wing at 35 degrees, allowing for greater speed. In fact, early jets would have to slow down to almost stalling speed because the propeller-driven KC-97 would be flying at flat-out speed, but that was still too slow for the jets. Here's footage of a B-52, and they've lowered the landing gear to slow it down to the tanker speed. There was no auxiliary power unit, so it was reliant on ground power units to power and start the aircraft. But engine number 3 could be fitted with an explosive charge for an alert launch, which would be done much faster and without any ground crew needed. Engine number 3 would explode into action and then air bled it to another, starting it, and then the other two turbofans could be started while taxiing. With a nuclear missile incoming, every second counted. If you can afford it, then please consider becoming a channel supporter. There currently aren't any benefits, but it helps me continue to make these videos. If you can't afford it, and that's perfectly fine, then please help out and give the video a thumbs up and comment below. This also helps support the work that I do to keep making these types of videos. Now let's head up the crew entrance behind the door with the yellow outline. From inside, the ladder folds down, and don't worry, the general would have another entrance, so no tears need to be shed. Here I am trying to clamber up one-handed while holding the camera in the other. Straight ahead of you is the seat for the boom operator to use during takeoff and landing when they weren't down the back operating the boom, as the name suggests. Behind them was a wall of circuit breakers. And moving around forward is the pilot in command on the left and the co-pilot on the right. There were also multiple windows higher up to provide a better view of the mothership donating their fuel. The cockpit is all analog, unlike later EC-135 derivatives that had been upgraded to include more modern systems. The orange circular device in the center is the display for the weather radar that was sitting behind the black nose I mentioned earlier, and there's the 4 standard throttles of the engine in the center in easy reach of both pilots. This here is a shield of the Strategic Air Command. And above that are 4 columns with engine parameters for the 4 turbofans. And above those were the red fire extinguisher controls. Moving back and looking briefly at the co-pilot seat where the displays are mostly mirrored, and we turn around and look at the navigator's seat. Now, unlike the 707, this does not have a flight engineer, with their role being managed by the co-pilot. Jet engines are far less complicated to manage in comparison to the older props. In fact, the flight engineer's role probably continued in other aircraft longer than was really needed, and that's because the unions wanted the position to continue, and there was also an idea that 3 brains in the cockpit were better than 2, especially during an emergency. These guys would use both inertial and GPS navigation systems, but they could also use a sextant through a window in the roof to identify the location by the stars. Now, during a potential war, GPS systems could be disabled, so the old-fashioned techniques would come back in. Tragically, a boom operator was partially sucked out through one of these windows after the glass failed, so then they were all eventually covered with a metal plate. Turning back around, and we see the boom operator seat again, and I didn't capture it, but here's a photo before the restoration of the aircraft of the fuel line coming down from the in-flight refueling receptacle above us. To orient yourself, here's the navigator's station here, and there's the pilot's throttle controls. This large black object is a fuel bladder designed to capture the fuel in case of anything breaking and avoiding it flooding the cockpit, which wouldn't be ideal, especially at 40,000 feet. Let's keep moving into the electronic equipment section. These were all very old analog systems that would generate a lot of heat, hence the piping system up above and to the side, which would provide cooling air. You may recall the air inlets I pointed out earlier, and that's for this. Looking up at these large pipes, and you can see that quite a lot of cooling air was moved through the system and eventually vented out. You'll also notice how much of the equipment is actually quite large, hence why the large doors were so useful. And as this aircraft was in service for so long, technology would change considerably during that time, hence new systems would be constantly being moved in and out. And here's the large cargo door, as this was designed as a general freighter as well. It wasn't until later aircraft such as the 747 freighter and C-5 Galaxy where they designed the whole nose to open up, allowing for easy access to the cargo hold. A set of external stairs could directly attach to down here so that the generals wouldn't have to climb the ladder that I did. This cylinder device here is called the fuse, and it was involved with protecting the aircraft against EMP, which stands for electromagnetic pulse. These are released from a nuclear explosion, amongst other things, and produce a huge current that will overload and destroy most electrical circuits nearby. This is connected to the aircraft structure and equipment and is designed to dissipate the pulse inside the spiral and sacrifice itself like a big fuse, so that the crew can continue to operate with their electronics and communication equipment. This here on the port side is the telephone exchange, which is an old-fashioned system but more secure. The wires were a particular anti-tampering type, and I should mention that many aspects of the design remain classified, so it's difficult to get some explanations, but I've done what I can. On the port side and spinning around on the starboard side, we see 2 emergency escape doors. Under the small window is a pouch labelled radiation barrier, and inside that was an object that would be positioned over the window to protect from the atomic flash. The cockpit windows had similar barriers stored above the boom operator's seats in the cockpit. In fact, you could get a quick glimpse of those as I crawled up at the very start. Of interest, the oils from your skin could negate its ability to reflect during a nuclear blast, so these were stored in containers with a lead seal, providing a visual indicator of if they had been opened. If they had to be thoroughly inspected and possibly replaced. The next section is the communication center. Here there were a whole array of communication equipment, allowing crew members to contact other bases all around the United States. It first flew in 1961 and would have been regularly upgraded with newer technology, but often they combine both state-of-the-art technology and older tech because the latter was felt to be far more reliable and less able to be intercepted. Such redundancy of every system was important during a potential nuclear conflict. This device here is a teleprinter, or a teletype. It's an electromechanical device used to send and receive typed messages. Looking up on the roof and you see the insulation, but also many wires. Some of these would have been for the aircraft's own operations, but many were also associated with the onboard communication and control systems. They would be connected to the peripheral sensors on the aircraft's skin and the equipment further forward that we just walked past, and that was fairly heavy and therefore needed to be positioned closer to the center of gravity rather than the battle staff way down the back. And looking at this hole here, and it was designed for the communication team to deliver messages into the battle staff in the next section. They could also communicate via an intercom system as well. And now moving into that battle staff area and looking behind on the wall are several first aid kits, and the yellow objects were portable oxygen bottles that could be used by the crew to walk around while the cabin was depressurized. The first position here was the logistics officer and non-commissioned officer. Their role was to ensure that returning bombers and tanker forces had a safe recovery basis to provide medical attention, food, rest for the crew, repairs and reloading. Next is their planning officer station, who was the second in command to the airborne emergency action officer, and they were in charge of advising the war plans available to the president. This old rotary dial phone was for secure voice communication between senior staff in the air and on the ground, such as the president or the SAC commanders. The next section was for the intelligence officers, and they would brief the battle staff about current and emerging threats. Now moving over to the other section, you have the AEAO communication officer, who worked with the next guy in the larger comfy chair, the most senior guy on the plane, the AEAO, who had the legal authority to launch the nuclear attack. Down here is the clacker box, and you'll notice that it had two locks because two different people had to be involved with the decision to launch. The nuclear launch consent keys were held by the Battle Staff Operations Officer and the AEAO I just mentioned, and they would also be used to open the clacker box to get the launch codes and then be inserted into the launch keyhole. And moving back towards the AEAO Comms Officer was the ALCS, which stands for the Airborne Launch Control System. These were able to transmit launch commands to ground-based ICBMs in the case that the Ground Launch Control Center was inoperable. Here under the transparent piece of plastic is that keyhole to launch a nuclear attack. And moving back past the clacker box and further forward to the other ALCS box, and this is intentionally several feet away from each other so that one person could not turn both keys at the same time. Both key slots were spring-loaded, so again you couldn't turn one and then run to the other. Here's a photo of Lieutenant General Glenn W. Martin turning the key during a practice, with a colleague doing the same in the background. And this here is where the top secret launch codes would be entered. And sitting in front of this were more crew positions. Now the layout of the aircraft did change throughout its career, so you will notice that some photos look a little different. And moving further aft, we walked towards the break room, which was important as these missions could be over 10 hours long. There's a table and chairs here on the port side, and they would have a steward on the flight looking after the crew. And here is one of their interesting documents, because it includes details of the generals on board and their preferences. Now this is an example with the name covered up, although the comments are all positive, but there were a few others with less than positive comments, but I haven't shown them. Turning around and onto the other side is the galley to prepare the meals, which would have been fairly basic. And down here behind it is the boom operator's station. Each EC-135 could both receive and deliver fuel. In fact, here's a photo of the receiving receptacle from on top above the cockpit. Here's a great photo of two EC-135s, with one completing their mission and transferring any extra fuel to the next aircraft. Remember that a large portion of fuel is used during takeoff and the climb. In fact, the SR-71 was almost running out of fuel shortly after takeoff, so you could extend it and the EC-135's range significantly by topping her up at cruise altitude when the rest of the fuel consumption would be a lot less. Back here is a bunk bed for the general to maintain their readiness to make what might be a significant and/or catastrophic decision. And right at the back of the aircraft before the pressure bulkhead are two toilets, which are considerably more spacious than most modern aircraft toilets. And this object here is the urinal. We'll turn around and head back outside again, and I'll point out a few more things as we proceed. It's interesting to step back and look at the whole cabin width as we walk through it. This here is a comparison between the original Dash 8 prototype, the KC-135, which this shares the fuselage with, and then the slightly wider 707 with an extra seat across that you can see, and also a Douglas DC-8 as well. So up until 1969, this was a large and wide aircraft, so you can only imagine why the 747 was just something out of this world. I mean, we're used to the wide-body airliners now, but comparatively, this looks quite narrow inside, and with more equipment, I can understand why they've now gone with the 707-based E6 with the slightly wider fuselage. I'll stop quickly here, and these controls here on the starboard side are to control that very low frequency antenna extending from underneath the aircraft that I mentioned outside. From 1998, the EC-135 Looking Glass were replaced by the US Navy E6 Mercury, which looks similar but is actually larger and based on the 707-320B aircraft. You may recall earlier that the 707 has a storage hold underneath the main deck, and here's doors to access those. Remember, the C-135 did not have those and instead had fuel tanks under there. The new jet was fitted with new efficient high bypass CFM turbofan engines shared with the upgraded KC-135R and the Boeing 737 next generation jets. As we walk through this fascinating piece of history, it's incredible to think how significant this was as a part of the nuclear deterrent to the Soviet Union, and seemingly successful in that role since we're all still sitting here watching this video. There are multiple other versions of this jet worth mentioning. There was the WC-135, officially called the Constant Phoenix, but nicknamed the Sniffer. This would collect atmospheric samples looking to detect nuclear explosions. It had external flow-through equipment that would collect atmospheric samples on paper, which could then be tested. It had a double air filtration system and in-cabin system to detect radiation that may have entered and could harm the crew. This handsome fella is an EC-135E called ARIA, which stands for the Apollo/Range Instrumentation Aircraft. NASA and the Department of Defense needed a mobile tracking and telemetry platform to support the Apollo and other programs, so they installed a steerable 7-foot antenna dish into 8 of these aircraft. They were nicknamed Droop Snoot or Snoopy Nose. This is an NKC-135 testbed aircraft, and on March 15, 2007, the YAL-1 747-based airborne laser successfully fired at this modified signboard target on its fuselage. This test proved that the laser could track and fire at a target while compensating for atmospheric conditions. This is a reconnaissance version, the RC-135, and operated by the USAF and British RAF up to this day. These are covered in a huge range of sensors and communication equipment to send the information back to the troops on the ground. As you can see, they are fitted with the upgraded CFM high bypass turbofan engines. This livery will look familiar, and it's the VIP transport version, the C-135B. These could be used by senior staff in the military and the government, and potentially the VP or president. This here is a VC-137, which is based on the 707, and this actual one is on display in Dayton and was used to carry JFK back to Washington for the final time, and Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as 36th president on board, and I tour around that video on my channel. This aircraft is on display to the public at the museum here near Omaha and well worth a visit. If you enjoyed the video, then please give it a thumbs up and check out my channel for many other similar guided tours around significant aircraft, including the F-117 Nighthawk, B-36 and B-47 Stratojet. Thanks for watching.